The German Shepherd hit the floor of Redwood Valley Animal Center like a storm. 100 pounds of scar tissue and suppressed panic, leash pulled so tight the handler's knuckles had gone white. Every technician in the room took 3 steps back. Someone knocked over a tray of instruments. A receptionist pressed herself flat against the wall. The dog's eyes were wild, sweeping the room like a surveillance camera, and his lips were peeled back just enough to show the tips of his teeth. "Nobody touches him," the man in the tactical jacket said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "He bites. He's a retired military working dog, and he doesn't tolerate strangers. We're here for a basic checkup, and that's it." Everyone nodded. Everyone except Lena Prescott, who was standing at the back of the intake room with a clipboard she'd forgotten she was holding, staring at the dog's left hip, at the way he was redistributing his weight, favoring his right side just slightly, like he'd been doing it so long it had become automatic, like the pain was so old it had become part of his posture. She wasn't looking at the teeth, she was looking at the dog's eyes. And for just a moment, beneath all that terror and trained aggression, she saw something else entirely. He wasn't dangerous. He was begging. If this story already has you leaning forward, good. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will stay with you. Like this video, subscribe so you don't miss a single part, and drop a comment with the city or country where you're watching from. I want to see how far Lena and Axel's story can travel. The name on the intake form was Axel, breed German Shepherd, age 9 years, service history 7 years with Naval Special Warfare, 2 combat deployments, retired from active duty 14 months prior. The handler's name was printed in bold at the top of the form, Captain Mason Reed, USN, Ratici. Lena read it twice. Then she looked up at Reed. He was tall, taller than she'd expected from across the room, with the kind of posture that made other people straighten their spines reflexively, even when they didn't mean to. Dark hair cut close, a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. He was carrying himself the way some veterans did, like the military hadn't just been a job but a second skeleton he still wore under his skin. He looked like the kind of man who got thanked for his service in airport terminals and accepted it without blinking. He was also looking at Lena the way people sometimes looked at furniture they hadn't noticed before, registering her existence, but not particularly caring about it. "We'll need to do a full intake assessment," Lena said. "Weight, temperature, brief physical exam." "He already told you," said Dr. Ferris from the doorway. Marcus Ferris was the head veterinarian at Redwood Valley Animal Center, and he had a way of inserting himself into conversations that made it feel like the conversations had been waiting for him. "Basic checkup. Captain Reed is on a schedule." "His gait is off," Lena said. She hadn't planned to say it yet, but it was out before she could weigh the room temperature. "He's compensating. Left hip, I think." "Lena." Ferris's voice carried the particular flatness of someone who had corrected the same person before and was tired of doing it. "Can you pull the scale?" She pulled the scale. She wrote down the weight, 89 pounds, which was light for a dog Axel's frame, and she said nothing else. But she watched. Reed kept Axel on a short leash the entire time. 3 feet of leather, and every time the dog shifted or lifted his head or looked toward the door, Reed's hand tightened. Not violently, just constantly. Like maintenance. Like the leash wasn't really about control so much as it was about reminding Axel that control existed. The dog's coat was clean but dull in places. His nails had been trimmed recently, but the pads of his feet were dry and cracked. When Ferris tried to run his hands along Axel's spine for the cursory check, the dog didn't bite. He flinched. A small, whole-body flinch, like a reflex he couldn't suppress, and then he immediately looked at Reed. Not at Ferris. At Reed. Lena had worked with enough animals to understand that particular look. It wasn't loyalty. It wasn't affection. It was the look of an animal monitoring the source of unpredictability. She kept that thought behind her teeth. Ferris finished in 7 minutes. He told Reed that Axel looked healthy for his age, prescribed a joint supplement for the stiffness, and handed off a printed care sheet that nobody in the room believed Reed was going to read. Ferris shook Reed's hand with both of his, the politician's handshake, and walked out. Reed began gathering the leash. "I'd like to do x-rays," Lena said. The room went quiet in a specific way. Reed turned slowly. "Excuse me?" His left hip. The compensation isn't new. You can see it in how his muscle has built up on the right side to offset the load. That's months of favoring that leg, minimum. I'd like to take a look at what's underneath. Reed looked at her with the flat patience of someone who had decided not to lose their temper but wanted her to know it was a choice. He was cleared by a military vet 14 months ago. 14 months is a long time. The military vet had more credentials than... He glanced at her scrubs, her ID badge. Whatever your position is here. I'm a veterinary technician. She kept her voice even. And I'm not questioning the military vet's credentials. I'm telling you what I'm seeing right now, today, in this room. Reed picked up the leash and looked at Ferris, who had reappeared in the doorway with the expression of someone hoping the conversation was over. Is this standard protocol? Because I was told this was going to be a routine visit. It is routine, Ferris said. Lena, I think we've covered... He's lost weight since his intake paperwork was filed, Lena said. That form was completed 3 months ago. He's down 6 pounds from the number listed. That's not a rounding error. Something shifted in Axel's posture when she spoke. She wasn't sure what it was, she didn't want to read into it, but the dog's ears had come forward slightly, and the tension in his jaw had changed. I appreciate your concern, Reed said, and his voice had returned to its original register, flat, dismissive, managing her the way you'd manage a mildly annoying situation. But we're done here. Send the bill to the address on file. He tugged the leash once, gently, and Axel fell into position beside him. That was the thing Lena couldn't stop watching, how immediately and completely Axel complied. No hesitation, no resistance. The kind of compliance that wasn't obedience anymore. The kind that lived in the nervous system. She watched them walk out through the glass front doors. She watched Reed open the rear door of a black truck and Axel jump in with some effort, left hind leg pushing off late, a millisecond behind the right, and she stood there holding the scales she still hadn't put away, feeling the particular low-grade discomfort of someone who has said the right thing at the wrong time and knows it isn't over. Ferris appeared at her shoulder. Next time, read the room before you push a client. His hip is being monitored by his owner. Ferris walked toward the back. We're a civilian clinic, not a VA. We don't override military medical assessments without cause. I'm saying there is cause. He didn't turn around. Lena Prescott had been at Redwood Valley Animal Center for 2.5 years, which was long enough to know where everything was, and short enough that certain people still treated her like she was new. She had come to the clinic sideways, through a 2-year vet tech program at a community college, after a year working at a county shelter, after a childhood spent in a house where the animals were better company than the people. She was 28 years old, and she had the kind of face that made people assume she was younger, which did not help her professionally. She was good at her job. She knew she was good at her job. She also knew that in a clinic where the senior staff had 4-year degrees and the head vet had published papers, being good at her job was not always enough to make people listen to her. She thought about Axel for 3 days. She pulled his chart, the thin one Ferris had created today, the one with almost nothing in it, and she cross-referenced the weight discrepancy. She wrote a note to Ferris requesting that they flag the case for a follow-up call. The note went unanswered. She wrote a second one. Ferris stopped her in the hallway and told her, not unkindly, that she needed to let it go. I've been doing this for 20 years, he said. Sometimes animals compensate for old injuries, and it doesn't mean anything catastrophic. The dog served in combat. He has wear. That's expected. The muscle atrophy on the left side isn't symmetrical with the right. Lena. He tilted his head slightly, the way adults do when they're explaining something to someone they've decided is smart but inexperienced. Not every instinct you have is going to be right. That's not a criticism. It's just true. Sometimes you're going to look at an animal and feel certain something is wrong, and you're going to be wrong. That's part of the job. She nodded. She went back to her station. She stared at the copy of Axel's intake photo she'd printed because she couldn't explain why, but she couldn't stop looking at it, and she thought about the way the dog had looked at Reed when Ferris touched him. Not at Ferris, at Reed. On day 4, Mason Reed called the clinic. She was the one who answered. Captain Reed, she said, keeping her voice professionally neutral. What can I help you with? Axel stopped eating. The flatness was still there, but there was something tighter underneath it now. 2 days ago. He's drinking water but won't touch the food. Has anything changed in his environment? Routine? New stressors? A pause. No. What are you currently feeding him? Same thing he's always eaten. High-protein dry kibble. Can you bring him in? Another pause, longer this time. I thought Dr. Ferris didn't see an issue. Dr. Ferris didn't see him not eating, Lena said. I'd like to take a look. She didn't wait for Ferris to sign off. She booked the appointment herself, in the afternoon slot, and she spent the 2 hours before it going through everything she knew about post-service working dogs, about musculoskeletal injuries in German Shepherds, about behavioral changes as an indicator of chronic pain. She pulled up 3 recent veterinary journals. She made notes in the margins of a legal pad she kept in her locker because her handwriting was faster than typing when she was thinking. When Reed came in with Axel, he came alone. No receptionist flagged the appointment to Ferris first. Lena brought them to exam room 2 and closed the door and took a breath. Thank you for coming back, she said. Reed sat down on the bench along the wall. Not in the chair. On the bench, like he'd positioned himself for a wider view of the room. You're the one who wanted us here. I'm glad you called. She crouched down, not at Axel's level right away, just lowering herself so she wasn't towering. I want to try something, and I'd like your permission first. Reed's eyebrows moved slightly. Maybe he hadn't expected her to ask. Go ahead. She extended her hand toward Axel, palm up, not reaching, just offering. And she waited. The dog looked at her hand, then at Reed, then at her hand again. Reed said nothing. He was watching. Axel took 1 step forward. 2. He sniffed her hand, then her wrist, then stood very still while she let her fingers move slowly toward his ear, and she scratched, carefully, gently, at the base of it. The sound Axel made was so quiet she almost missed it. Not a growl, the opposite of a growl, something that came from somewhere deep in his chest that had probably been locked down for a long time. Reed was staring at the dog with an expression Lena couldn't fully read. When did he last have a full physical workup? She asked. She kept her voice conversational, kept her hands moving in slow, easy circles. 14 months ago, I told you. Before discharge? Standard pre-retirement assessment. He was cleared. What did they find? That he was healthy enough to retire. Reed shifted on the bench. He's 9. There's some natural wear. Did they run x-rays? A beat. Standard protocol. I'd like to run new ones. She looked up at him. Today, if that's okay. The weight loss combined with the refusal to eat. I want to rule out what I think I'm seeing. Which is what? She held his gaze. I'd rather have the images first. Ferris found her 20 minutes into the x-ray prep. Who authorized this? He said from the doorway, with the very specific energy of someone who had just looked at the appointment log and felt blindsided. I did, Lena said. She was positioning the plate, and she didn't stop. Captain Reed consented. That's not how this works. He called because Axel stopped eating. I'm doing a diagnostic workup. Ferris came all the way into the room. He was a careful man, not given to raised voices, and that was almost worse because when he lowered his voice, it had a particular weight. I told you to let this case go. And then the dog stopped eating. Which can happen for a dozen reasons that have nothing to do with whatever you think you spotted. Then the x-rays will confirm that, and I'll apologize for wasting everyone's time. She pressed the button to start the machine. But I'd like to know. He stayed in the doorway for a long moment. Then he left. She knew she'd pay for it later. She took the images anyway. The first image came up on the monitor and she pulled her stool closer and leaned in and looked at the left hip joint, and she felt something cold move through her chest. She enlarged the image. She pulled up the second. The third. Axel was lying on the table behind her, sedated light, just enough to keep him still. And she sat with the images for a long moment, making sure she was reading them correctly, making sure she wasn't seeing what she wanted to see rather than what was there. She wasn't misreading them. The hip dysplasia was severe. That was visible and expected, the kind of wear that accumulated over years of demanding work. But it was the other findings that made her hands go still. There were healed fractures in 2 places that did not correspond to any documented injury in Axel's service record, not old fractures from working deployments. The calcification patterns were wrong for that, the bone density inconsistent with the age the fractures would have needed to be. These fractures were newer, post-retirement newer. She sat with that for a full minute, making sure. Then she stood up. She walked to the door. She walked back. She sat down again. She looked at the images one more time, enlarging each quadrant, checking her math. She wasn't wrong. She picked up the phone and called the extension for exam room 2, where she'd left Reed with a technician for the wait, and she said, "Captain Reed, can you come to the imaging suite for a moment?" What? He came alone. He stood in the doorway and looked at the monitor and said nothing for a moment. "These are the images from today," Lena said. She kept her voice measured, clinical. She pointed to the hip. "This is the dysplasia. It's significant, and it's been impacting his movement for some time. That's consistent with what I observed during his first visit." She moved her finger. "This is what I want to ask you about." She pointed to the fractures. "These are healed, but not old. Based on the bone density and the calcification pattern, I'm estimating these occurred somewhere between 6 and 12 months ago." She looked at him. "That's after Axel's retirement from active service." Reed looked at the screen. His face had not moved. "His pre-retirement assessment," Lena said. "Was it thorough?" "I already told you it was." "Would it have caught post-service injuries?" "It wasn't a post-service assessment. It was a pre-retirement assessment. There's a difference." "Right." She nodded. "So if something happened after retirement, what are you implying?" His voice had dropped, very low, very controlled. She held her ground. She was aware, peripherally, that her heart rate had gone up, and she made a deliberate choice not to let it reach her face. "I'm asking how these fractures happened. I'm not implying anything. I'm asking." "He's a working dog. He had an active career. Old injuries present in different ways." "These aren't old," she said, as gently and as clearly as she could manage. "I know what old fractures look like on a film. These have a different signature. The body responds differently to healing at different points in life, and these," she pointed again, "happened recently." The silence stretched. "I'd like to file a report," Lena said, "with the Oregon Veterinary Medical Examining Board, as a precautionary measure, until we understand." "No." Reed stepped closer. Not aggressively. He stopped a full 2 feet from her. But the step itself was deliberate, and she felt it. "You are a vet tech in a civilian clinic. You don't have the authority, the credentials, or the background to interpret military medical data and make accusations against—" "I'm not making accusations. I'm documenting what I'm seeing. You're a technician." His voice was very quiet now. "You take temperatures and fill forms and assist. You don't diagnose and you don't report, and you don't insert yourself into situations that are above your pay grade. Do you understand me?" She looked at him for a long moment. "I understand that you're asking me not to file the report," she said. "I want to be clear that I heard you." She left the pause there. She didn't fill it. He left first. She filed the report that night from her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her laptop. She uploaded the X-ray images. She wrote her observations clearly, without overstatement. She documented the weight loss, the gait abnormality, the behavioral indicators, the fracture findings, and the timeline discrepancy. Then she emailed a copy to Ferris, because whatever happened next, she wasn't going to do it without him knowing. His reply came at 11:15 p.m. "We will discuss this tomorrow morning." She slept badly. She lay in the dark and thought about the way Axel had looked at Reed in that first intake room, the monitoring, the compliance. She thought about the sound the dog had made when she'd scratched behind his ear, that small, locked-up sound. And she thought about the fractures on the film, and she stared at the ceiling for a long time. At 7 in the morning, she got up and showered and drove to work. Ferris was waiting in his office with the door closed, which was how she knew it was going to be a specific kind of conversation. She sat down across from him, and she waited. "I called the examining board this morning," he said, "to walk back the report." She kept her face still. "You can't do that. I filed it. It's under my name. I'm the supervising veterinarian at this clinic. If a technician under my supervision files a report without authorization, there's no protocol requiring authorization for a mandatory concern report. I looked it up." Ferris put his hands flat on the desk. He wasn't angry. He was something worse than angry. He was disappointed in a way that was trying to become practical, trying to become managerial. "Lena, I'm trying to protect this clinic, and I'm trying to protect you. Mason Reed is a retired Navy SEAL. He has connections. He has lawyers. If you file a complaint against him based on an interpretation of an X-ray that a board-certified radiologist may not, then let a board-certified radiologist look at the images and tell me I'm wrong." She kept her voice even. "I want to be wrong, Dr. Ferris. I genuinely want someone to look at those films and tell me I'm reading them incorrectly, but that requires someone looking at them. A radiologist consult costs, then bill Captain Reed. The silence was different now. Send him home, Ferris said finally. She looked up. What? Captain Reed called me this morning. He wants Axel discharged today. Given the circumstances, the report, the conversation last night, I think it's best if we release the animal to his owner and close the case. The cold thing moved through her chest again, sharper this time. If we discharge Axel today, she said slowly, and those fractures are what I think they are, we don't know what they are. We don't know because nobody has looked at them yet. Lena. His voice had gone very soft. I need you to understand your position here. You are not a veterinarian. You don't have the credentials to make this diagnosis, and if this goes sideways, you will be the one who pays for it. Not Reed, not the clinic. You. She looked at the desk between them. She looked at the diplomas on his wall, all those frames of accomplished certainty. I understand, she said. She stood up. She walked out of his office. She went to the supply room and she pulled on her exam gloves and she stood there for a moment with her hands pressed flat against the metal shelving, breathing. Then she took out her phone and called the Oregon Department of Agriculture, Animal Services Division, and she asked to speak to the duty investigator. Reed arrived at the clinic at 10 a.m. to collect Axel. Lena was at the front desk when he walked in. She watched him sign the discharge paperwork. She watched him take the leash from the technician who'd gone to retrieve Axel from the kennel. She watched Axel come through the door, that familiar weight redistributing walk, the left hip settling late, and she watched the dog stop. Axel stopped 3 feet from Reed. He looked at Lena, and he just stood there, not pulling toward her, not making a sound, just standing in the middle of the lobby looking at her with those dark, exhausted eyes, and the leash in Reed's hand went taut. Let's go, Reed said to the dog. Axel didn't move. Reed said it again, with a quiet authority that Lena had no doubt had once made other people move. Axel, let's go! The dog took one step, not toward Reed, toward Lena. Reed pulled the leash short and something in his expression flickered, just briefly, just for a half second, and then it was gone, back behind the flat, professional surface. He walked out. He took Axel with him. Lena watched through the glass doors as Reed opened the back of the truck and Axel climbed in. She watched Reed get in the driver's seat. She watched the truck pull out of the lot and turn north. Then she went back to her desk, and she picked up her phone and she texted the Animal Services investigator the license plate number she'd memorized while she was standing at the window. Her hands were shaking slightly. She set the phone down. She picked up the next chart waiting in her stack. She breathed. Ferris came by her desk at noon and told her, without looking at her, that she was on administrative review, effective today, pending an assessment of her conduct related to the Reed case. She would continue performing her normal duties, but she was not to contact Captain Reed, not to access his file, and not to take any further external action without clinic approval. She said, I understand. She went to the break room and ate half a sandwich she didn't taste. At 2:17 in the afternoon, her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, Oregon area code, but unfamiliar. She stepped outside to answer it. Ms. Prescott? A woman's voice, efficient and direct. This is Investigator Diane Carver, Oregon Animal Services. I've received your report and the associated images. I'd like to set up a meeting. There are some elements of what you've submitted that I need to discuss with you in person. Lena's grip on the phone tightened. When? She said. Tomorrow morning, if you're available. And Ms. Prescott, a pause. Don't discharge any documentation you have related to this case. Keep everything. I may need to ask for it. After she hung up, Lena stood in the parking lot for a moment with the afternoon sun hitting the pavement and the sound of the clinic humming steadily on the other side of the wall. She thought about Axel's eyes in the lobby. She thought about a dog who had spent 7 years learning to trust the person holding his leash and what it would take to make him stop. She thought about the way he'd stepped toward her instead of toward Reed, just that one step, just that small, quiet statement before the leash went taut. She went back inside. She had work to do. She had work to do, and the next morning came faster than she was ready for. Lena was at the clinic by 7:15, 45 minutes before her shift started, because she couldn't sit in her apartment anymore. She'd been up since 5, going back through everything she'd saved, the images, the intake notes, the weight chart she'd constructed from the 2 visits, the handwritten observations from her legal pad. She'd organized them into a folder on her laptop and printed a second copy because she didn't trust herself not to leave the digital version somewhere careless. Investigator Diane Carver arrived at 8:50 in a gray sedan that looked like every government car ever made. She was in her mid-40s, compact, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose. She shook Lena's hand with a brisk, dry grip, accepted the coffee Lena offered, and set it to the side almost immediately. "I've looked at the images you submitted," Carver said. They were sitting in the small staff conference room, the door closed, and Carver had a laptop of her own open to a file Lena couldn't read from across the table. "I want to be straightforward with you. I'm not here to tell you whether you're right or wrong. I'm here because the fracture patterns you flagged are inconsistent with the service record we were able to pull from the Naval Special Warfare Administrative Office." Lena sat very still. "You already pulled the record?" "We have a working relationship with certain federal contacts for exactly this type of case." Carver pushed her glasses up. "The dog's service record documents 2 significant injury incidents during deployment. One to the right forepaw in year 3, one to the right shoulder in year 5. Neither of those is what you flagged." "The left hip fractures," Lena said, "are not in the record." Carver looked at her directly. "Which could mean several things. It could mean the pre-retirement assessment missed them. Possible, but unlikely, given the protocol. It could mean they were documented separately and the records were not transferred correctly, which happens more than it should. Or it could mean they happened after the record was closed." "Yes." Carver's voice didn't change. She wasn't confirming or denying. She was just letting the sentence exist. "What I need from you today is a formal written account of your observations across both visits. Not the filed report. I have that. A narrative. What you saw, what you noticed, what the dog's behavior looked like. In your own words, not clinical language. You want me to describe how he acted. I want you to tell me what a person who works with animals every day saw when she looked at this particular animal." Carver tapped one finger on the table. "Because what shows up on a film and what shows up in behavior sometimes tell different parts of the same story, and right now I need both." Lena wrote for 40 minutes. Carver sat across from her, reading something on her own screen, occasionally making notes. The coffee went cold. At one point, Ferris passed the window in the door, saw them, and kept walking without stopping, which told Lena something about how he'd decided to handle the situation. When she handed the pages to Carver, the investigator read them without speaking for a long time. Then she looked up. "You said the dog stepped toward you in the lobby," she said, "when Reed was taking him out." "Yes." "And Reed pulled the leash before he could come to you." "Yes." Carver looked at the pages again. She didn't say anything else about it, but she folded the pages carefully and put them in a folder with the file number written on the tab and marker, and something about that deliberateness felt more significant to Lena than any words would have. "What happens now?" Lena asked. "We conduct a welfare check." Carver closed the folder. "Within 72 hours, one of our investigators and a designated veterinarian will visit the address on file for Captain Reed and assess the animal's current condition. And if the condition is one step at a time." Carver picked up the coffee she'd never touched, looked at it, and put it back down. "Ms. Prescott, I want to be honest with you about something. Cases involving retired military working dogs are complicated. There are jurisdictional questions, there are federal interests, and there are public sympathy dynamics that can make it difficult to move as quickly as we'd like. If what you're saying is accurate, this will take longer than it should. I want you to be prepared for that." "How much longer?" Carver didn't answer directly, which was itself an answer. After she left, Lena went to the supply room and stood with her back against the shelving and counted to 10 in her head, the way she'd taught herself to do when she was a kid in a house that was too loud. Then she put on her gloves and went to work. Ferris didn't call her into his office. He didn't avoid her either. He existed in a careful middle zone, professionally present, making eye contact when necessary, speaking to her only about specific patient matters. It was the management strategy of a man who had decided to wait and see which way the wind was going to blow before he committed to any particular position, and Lena understood it well enough to find it more sad than insulting. The rest of the clinic staff was harder to read. Yolanda at the front desk was openly curious in a way she was trying to hide. Dev, one of the other techs, had heard something. She could tell from the way he looked at her chart during rounds, slightly longer than usual, slightly more careful. Nobody asked her directly. The clinic was small enough that everyone knew something was happening and professional enough that nobody was going to be the first one to say so out loud. 3 days passed. She heard nothing from Carver. On the 4th day, she texted the investigator a single line. "Any update on the welfare check?" The reply came 4 hours later. "Conducted yesterday. Report pending internal review. I'll be in touch." She stared at that for a long time. On the 5th day, Reed called the clinic. She didn't know he'd called until Yolanda came to find her with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. "Dr. Ferris wants to see you. Captain Reed is on with him." She walked to Ferris's office. The door was open. Ferris was on speaker, sitting back in his chair with his hands in his lap. And when he saw Lena in the doorway, he made a small gesture that meant she should stay there and not say anything. "Have retained legal counsel," Reed was saying. His voice through the speaker was the same as it was in person. Flat, measured, carrying its own kind of pressure. "The report filed by your technician constitutes a defamatory statement made without the qualifications required to support it. My attorney is in the process of sending a formal letter, but I wanted to speak directly with you first as a professional courtesy." Ferris was nodding, though Reed couldn't see him. It was a reflex. "I appreciate you calling, Captain. I want you to know that we take this situation very seriously, and we've already begun an internal review of the procedures followed during your visits." "The procedures aren't the issue," Reed cut through it cleanly. "The issue is that an unqualified individual filed a report with a state agency based on an interpretation she's not credentialed to make. That has consequences for my reputation, for my record, and for my ability to work with military and veterans organizations in this region. I'd like to understand what your clinic intends to do about it." Ferris glanced at Lena. She met his eyes and said nothing. "We're going to address this through our internal HR process," Ferris said carefully. "And I want to assure you that we value our relationship with the veteran community and that I'd like to know if the technician is still employed there." The pause lasted about 2 seconds too long. "She's on administrative review," Ferris said. "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have right now." Another pause. When Reed spoke again, his voice had shifted. Not louder, not harsher, but somehow more present, like he'd moved closer to the phone on his end. "Dr. Ferris, I spent 12 years in naval special warfare. I understand bureaucratic processes. I also understand that some situations resolve themselves more cleanly when everyone involved makes the right decisions early. I'd encourage your clinic to make the right decision here." The call ended. Ferris didn't say anything for a moment. He was looking at the phone. "He's threatening you," Lena said. "He's expressing concerns. He's threatening the clinic so you'll fire me." She wasn't heated about it. She was just saying what was true. "That's what that was." Ferris rubbed his face with one hand. He looked tired, genuinely tired, not performatively. And for a moment he looked less like the authority figure she'd been pushing against and more like a man trying to keep something intact that was under pressure from too many directions. "Lena," he said, "I need you to understand what I'm trying to balance here. This clinic—" "I know." She cut him off, but not harshly. "I know what you're balancing. I've known since the day I filed that report." She looked at him directly. "But I also know what's on those films. And I know what I saw in that lobby, and I cannot make those things untrue by staying quiet about them." He looked at his desk. "If the welfare check doesn't turn up anything, it turned up something." She watched his face. "I can tell by how you're sitting right now. You know something came back from that report." He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it either. She went back to her station. The next morning, she arrived to find a letter in her employee inbox, formal clinic letterhead, dated yesterday. Administrative review had been elevated. Pending completion of review, she was to perform no diagnostic assessments beyond her standard technician duties, no imaging requests, no external communications on behalf of the clinic, no contact with Captain Reed or his legal representation. She folded the letter and put it in her locker. She was checking in a golden retriever with a tooth abscess when her phone buzzed. Unknown number, different from Carver's. She let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was 17 seconds long. She listened to it in the break room with her back to the door. It was a man's voice, not Reed's. Quieter than Reed's, and older. He said, "Miss Prescott, my name is Lieutenant Commander Roland Voss. I'm retired Naval Criminal Investigative Service. I've been contacted by Oregon Animal Services regarding the case you've initiated. I'd like to speak with you privately. Please don't call me back on this number. I'll try you again at noon." She listened to it twice. She deleted it. Then she sat down on the break room bench and stared at the wall for a while. Roland Voss called back at 12:03 while she was eating a granola bar over the sink. She stepped outside into the staff lot, which was empty at this hour, with the late October wind coming off the valley and the mountains to the east showing their first serious snow. "Thank you for picking up," Voss said. He had the kind of voice that had been through a lot of conversations and knew how to move through them. "I'll keep this short. I have reason to believe the welfare check conducted at Captain Reed's property yielded findings that are going to result in escalation beyond what Oregon Animal Services typically handles." She gripped the phone. "What kind of escalation?" "The kind that involves more than one agency." He paused. "I'm not in a position to tell you details because I don't have full visibility right now. What I can tell you is that you should keep copies of everything you've submitted, physical copies, in more than one location." "You're telling me to protect my records." "I'm telling you it would be prudent." "Mr. Voss, Lieutenant Commander." She stopped, started again. "Can you tell me if Axel is okay?" The pause that came was small, but she felt its shape. "He's been removed from the property," Voss said. "That's all I can say." She exhaled slowly. "He's going to be at Carver's facility?" "At a licensed holding facility associated with the State Veterinary Board, yes. He'll receive care there." "Good." Her voice came out slightly uneven and she made herself steady it. "That's good." "Miss Prescott." Voss's voice shifted just slightly. "I want to be straightforward with you about something. What you've done here has set things in motion that are going to be complicated and probably unpleasant for you before they're anything else. The people who are going to look at this case are going to look very carefully at you, your credentials, your history, your motivations. They're going to ask why a vet tech with no military background inserted herself into a case involving a decorated veteran." "Because the dog was hurt," she said. A beat. "Yes," he said. "I know, but they're going to ask anyway." He paused. "I just want you to be ready." After the call, she stood in the parking lot for a moment. The wind pushed at her scrubs, and a car turned into the lot and parked 3 spaces down, and the driver got out with a cat carrier and didn't look at her. She thought about Axel at a facility somewhere, in a kennel that wasn't Reed's house. She thought about him lying in a run with clean water and no leash, and nobody needing anything from him, just existing in the specific silence that animals inhabited when the pressure came off. She hoped it felt like relief. She went back inside. The formal letter from Reed's attorney arrived at the clinic the following Tuesday, a 9-page document full of language that was both very precise and very aggressive about the difference between a veterinary technician's legal authority to file a state report and a board-certified veterinarian's authority to do the same. It cited 3 specific regulations. It included a section on reputational damages. It requested, in writing, the names of all staff members involved in the case and copies of all internal communications. Ferris called an emergency staff meeting. There were 6 people in the room. The associate veterinarian, Dr. Patricia Woolley, who had been with the clinic for 8 years and had an opinion about everything, but usually delivered it in a tone so calm it was hard to argue with. Devin Yolanda and 2 other technicians Lena had worked alongside every day for 2.5 years. And Ferris, who stood at the front with his hands clasped, and explained the situation in the careful, measured language of a man trying to present a crisis as a process. "The bottom line," he said when he'd finished the overview, "is that this letter constitutes a formal legal action and we need to respond. Our insurance counsel is reviewing it. We are cooperating fully." "Cooperating with Reed?" Dev said. "Cooperating with the legal process. That means providing documentation when required by subpoena, and it means being very careful about what we say publicly." Lena was sitting at the end of the table. She hadn't said anything yet. "It also means," Ferris said, and now he was looking at her, "that the clinic cannot be positioned as having endorsed actions taken outside of standard protocol. If this goes to litigation, the question of whether the report was filed within appropriate authority will be central." "The report was filed correctly," Dr. Wool said. She wasn't looking at anyone in particular. "I've read the regulation. Veterinary technicians in Oregon have reporting authority for suspected animal abuse under ORS 686.445. There's no board certification requirement." The room went a little quieter. Ferris opened his mouth. "I looked it up on Sunday," Wool said, still in that perfectly calm voice, "because I wanted to understand what we were actually dealing with." It was the first time anyone in that room besides Lena had said anything that sounded like a defense of what she'd done, and Lena felt it land in her chest in a way she hadn't expected, warm and slightly overwhelming, and she blinked once and looked at the table. "That's noted," Ferris said. "But the legal question isn't just about authority, it's about the basis for the report, and whether the evidence, the welfare check, removed the animal from the property," Wool said. The room went quiet again, differently this time. Ferris hadn't mentioned the welfare check. Lena hadn't mentioned it either, because she technically wasn't supposed to have outside information about the case. She didn't look at either Ferris or Woole, because she wasn't sure what she'd see. "Where did you hear that?" Ferris said. "I have my own sources in the veterinary community," Wool said. "Oregon's small." She finally looked at Ferris directly. "If they removed the dog, Marcus, that means they found something." The meeting ended without resolution. Lena drove home that evening through the valley with the radio off, watching the last gray light drain out of the sky behind the ridgeline. She felt scraped out, not devastated, just emptied by the sustained effort of being careful and steady in a situation that kept expanding in ways she hadn't predicted. She ate leftover soup and sat on her couch and called her sister in Medford, who was the only person she talked to about things that mattered, and she told her what had been happening. Her sister, who was practical and direct and had a 3-year-old who was screaming somewhere in the background the entire time, said, "You filed the report. That's done. You can't undo it and you wouldn't want to. Now you just have to keep going." "I know," Lena said. "You're going to get fired." "Possibly." "Is the dog okay?" "He's at a state facility." "Then you did it." A pause, and then in the background the screaming intensified and her sister said something away from the phone and came back. "That's the part that was yours to do. Everything else is someone else's part." After she hung up, she sat with that for a while. The next morning was a Thursday. She was in the middle of a post-surgery recovery check on a spaniel when Yolanda knocked on the exam room door with an expression that had moved past careful neutrality into something that looked like barely controlled urgency. "There's someone here," Yolanda said. "Federal. She's asking for you by name." Lena looked up from the spaniel. "What agency?" Yolanda glanced at the card in her hand. "NCIS." Lena carefully set down the instrument she was holding. She stripped her gloves. She looked at the spaniel, who was groggy but stable and giving her the half-focused look of a dog coming out of sedation, and she said quietly, "Good boy. You did great." Then she walked out to the lobby. The woman standing at the front desk was in plain clothes, dark slacks, a blazer, dark hair pulled back. She was holding a badge wallet open, though Yolanda had clearly already seen it. She was maybe 35, and she had the specific alert stillness of someone trained to read a room continuously without appearing to do so. "Ms. Prescott," she said. She didn't introduce herself yet. She glanced at the other people in the lobby, 2 clients with pets, both clearly curious, and then back at Lena. "Is there somewhere private we can talk?" Lena brought her to exam room 1, which was empty. She closed the door. The agent opened her badge wallet again. "Special Agent Tamara Osei, Naval Criminal Investigative Service." She said it like she'd said it 10,000 times, which she probably had. "I've been assigned to a case that involves a retired military working dog named Axel and his former handler, Captain Mason Reed. Your name appears as the originating complainant." "I'm aware," Lena said. "I'd like to ask you some questions. You're not required to answer, and you're free to have an attorney present." "I don't need an attorney," Lena said. "I reported suspected animal abuse based on my clinical observations. I'll answer whatever you ask." Osei looked at her for a moment, the same kind of assessment Carver had done, but faster, more practiced. "All right." She took out a recorder. "Do you consent to this being recorded?" "Yes." "Good." Osei set it on the exam table between them. "Ms. Prescott, I need to ask you about the X-ray images you submitted in your original report. Specifically, I need to know whether you consulted with anyone else, inside or outside the clinic, before or after you filed." Lena looked at the recorder. "No one at the clinic reviewed the images before I filed. After I filed, Dr. Ferris told me he was going to contact the examining board to walk back the report. He didn't consult me before attempting that." "And outside the clinic?" "I received a call from a man who identified himself as Lieutenant Commander Roland Voss, retired NCIS. She watched Osei's face carefully. He told me the welfare check had resulted in escalation. He didn't give me details. Something in Osei's expression sharpened slightly. She didn't comment on Voss's name. The imaging you submitted, she said. In your assessment, were those fractures consistent with the dog's documented service injuries? No. The documented injuries were to the right forepaw and right shoulder. The fractures I identified were in the left hip. Different age, different bone density pattern, different mechanism of injury. What mechanism? Lena held the agent's gaze. Blunt force, she said. Repeated, low to moderate impact over time. Not a single traumatic event. The exam room was very quiet. Osei made a note. Ms. Prescott, I'm going to tell you something that will likely become public information within the next 24 to 48 hours. She looked up from her notes. When investigators conducted the welfare check at Captain Reed's property, they found Axel in a condition that supported your findings. Additional injuries were documented on site. Physical evidence was collected from the property. Lena's hands, resting on the exam table, went still. Mason Reed was asked to come in for voluntary questioning this morning, Osei continued. He declined and requested counsel. She paused. His attorney filed a motion this afternoon to have your original report classified as outside the scope of your professional authority. That motion was denied 2 hours ago by the State Board. The motion Reed had filed, the one designed to erase the basis for everything, denied. Lena let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. There's something else I need to ask you, Osei said. Her voice had leveled out, become more direct. And I want you to understand that what you tell me in this room carries weight in an active federal investigation. Lena nodded. When Captain Reed brought Axel into this clinic on the second visit, did Axel display any behavior that struck you as unusual, given the presence of his handler? She thought about the lobby, the taut leash, the one step toward her that hadn't been asked for or expected. Yes, she said. Can you describe it? He moved toward me. She kept her voice steady. Reed pulled him back, but Axel stepped toward me first, without being called. Osei was writing. In my experience, Lena said, a dog doesn't move toward a near stranger and away from his handler unless the handler is the more frightening option. Osei clicked her pen closed. Thank you, she said. She picked up the recorder. She looked at Lena for a moment with an expression that was professional but not unkind. We may need to bring you in for a formal statement. I'll be in touch. She left. Lena sat in exam room 1 for a while after the door closed. She could hear the regular sounds of the clinic through the wall, phones and voices, and the particular frequency of the building going about its day, innocent and constant. She looked at the exam table, at the space where the recorder had been. She was still sitting there when Dev knocked and opened the door, and said very quietly, You okay? She thought about that. I think so. He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else and didn't know how to start it. Finally, he said, Whatever's happening with Reed and the case, I just want you to know that I looked at the chart. Both visits. I saw the weights. He stopped. I should have said something sooner. She looked at him. He looked genuinely uncomfortable, which meant it was genuine. You're saying it now, she said. He nodded once and left. She got up. She went back to work. She checked on the recovering spaniel, who was more alert now and thumping his tail weakly against the kennel door, and she gave him fresh water and spoke quietly to him until he settled. At 4:15 p.m., she received a text from an unknown number, different from Voss's, different from Osei's. Just 8 words. Check the public records portal. State Board. Tonight. She didn't know who sent it. At 7:30, sitting at her kitchen table with her laptop, she pulled up the Oregon State Veterinary Medical Examining Board public records portal and searched Mason Reed's name. The document that appeared had been filed at 5:52 p.m. that afternoon. It was a preliminary notice of formal investigation citing the welfare check findings, the X-ray evidence, and the testimony of a veterinary professional whose name was redacted but whose case file number she recognized immediately. Attached to it, flagged as Exhibit A, were Axel's X-rays, the ones she'd taken, the ones Ferris had tried to walk back, that Reed's attorney had tried to invalidate, that a motion had attempted to erase. They were on record now. Official. Publicly filed. She sat with her hands around a mug of tea that had gone cold, and she read the document 3 times. Then she closed the laptop. Outside her window, the valley was dark and the mountains were invisible under the clouds. And somewhere in a state-licensed facility not far from here, a German shepherd with a broken hip and healed fractures that nobody was supposed to notice was lying in a kennel away from the man who had hurt him. Lena pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at the ceiling. Then her phone lit up with a message from Yolanda. Ferris just sent a clinic-wide email. He's scheduling a mandatory staff meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m. Subject line just says important development. She stared at the message. Then 3 minutes later, a second text from Yolanda, with no context, no explanation. Also, Reed showed up at the clinic tonight, after closing. He wasn't alone. She read Yolanda's second text 3 times. Reed showed up at the clinic tonight, after closing. He wasn't alone. Lena's first instinct was to call Yolanda back immediately, but she stopped herself and typed instead, "Are you there now? Are you safe?" The reply came in under a minute. No, I left before he came, Sandra told me. She was finishing charts and saw them in the parking lot through the window. 2 men, Reed and someone else. They were there for about 10 minutes and then left. Did they try to come in? Sandra said Reed knocked. Nobody answered. She stayed in the back. Lena sat with that. Reed at the clinic after hours, after the state board filing, after his attorney's motion had been denied. Not calling ahead, not sending a formal communication, just showing up in a parking lot in the dark with someone she didn't know. She texted Yolanda. Tell Sandra to document what she saw. Time, description, anything she remembers. Send it to me tonight if possible. Then she sat back and tried to think clearly. The filing was public. Reed would have known within hours. His attorney would have told him, and whatever calculation he'd been running since Lena's original report had just changed. The document was on record, the evidence was categorized, and a motion to invalidate it had been turned back. Going to the clinic afterward wasn't panic. A man like Reed didn't panic. It was something more controlled than that, and more deliberate. And that was what made her stomach tighten. She packed everything she had, all the printed copies, the legal pad with her handwritten notes, the USB drive she'd made of the imaging files, into a canvas bag and drove to her sister's house in Medford at 9:30 that night without explaining why in the text she sent first. Her sister opened the door, took one look at her, and didn't ask questions until the bag was inside and the door was locked. Then she said, "Tell me." Lena told her. All of it, the parts she'd held back on the phone. Her sister listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when it was done she was quiet for a moment. "You need a lawyer," she said. "I know." "Not for the case. For you. Someone who knows employment law and can tell you what your exposure is if the clinic decides to make you the problem." "I know," Lena said again. She slept on the pull-out couch and left before 6 with the bag, and drove back to Redwood Valley in the gray pre-dawn, and she was at her desk 40 minutes before anyone else arrived. Ferris's 8 a.m. meeting began with everyone seated and the door closed and Ferris standing at the front of the room with a sheet of paper in his hand that he didn't look at once. "I want to speak directly," he said. Yesterday, the State Veterinary Board filed a formal investigative notice naming Mason Reed in connection with the welfare check conducted on his property. The clinic's original X-ray documentation was attached as evidentiary exhibit. No one spoke. This means we are now, as an institution, involved in an active investigation. Our insurance counsel has advised us on how to proceed. Effective immediately, I'm requesting that all staff direct any inquiries, from media, from outside parties, from anyone who contacts you in a personal capacity about this case, to the clinic's administrative line. Dev said, quietly. "Is Lena in trouble?" Ferris looked at him. "Everyone connected to this case should be careful." "That's not what I asked." "Dev!" Ferris's voice tightened just slightly. "I'm trying to give everyone the information they need." Dr. Wool, sitting at the far end of the table with her hands folded, said, "The state board accepted the report. The motion to invalidate it was denied. That means the regulatory framework has already assessed the question of Lena's authority and answered it." She wasn't raising her voice. She never raised her voice. "I think what the staff needs to hear is whether this clinic is going to support the person who brought this forward or distance itself from her." The room was very still. Ferris looked at the table. He looked like a man doing mental arithmetic in a situation where none of the numbers came out clean. Then he said, The clinic will cooperate fully with the investigation. Lena's administrative review is being suspended pending outcomes. It wasn't a declaration of support. It was a hedge. But it meant the letter in her locker had stopped moving forward, at least for now, and Lena took it for what it was. After the meeting, Wule caught her in the hallway. "You have a board-certified radiologist you've been in contact with?" she asked. Quiet, direct. "No, I submitted the images myself. I have a colleague at the Oregon State University Veterinary Program, orthopedic specialist. I'd like to send her the images for a formal secondary read." She looked at Lena steadily. "If the board challenges the interpretation, you'll want corroboration from someone with credentials they can't question." Lena stared at her for a moment. "Why are you doing this?" Wool considered that with the unhurried seriousness she brought to everything. "Because I looked at the images myself, and you're not wrong." She paused. "And because I've watched this clinic sidestep things for 20 years, and I'm tired of it." She walked away before Lena could respond. Special Agent Osei called at 10:45. "I need you to come in," she said. "Today, if possible. Our field office in Eugene." "What's happened?" "We conducted a second search of the property this morning, early, before Reed's attorney could file for an injunction." A pause. "We found additional documentation, physical records that were not part of his disclosure." Lena's grip on the phone tightened. "What kind of records?" "Medical. Related to Axel." Osei's voice was measured, giving nothing more than the essentials. "Some of it is consistent with your timeline assessment. Some of it goes further back than you identified." "Farther back." The cold thing moved through her chest again. "I'll be there," she said. She drove the hour and 20 minutes to Eugene on her lunch break, which she extended without asking permission because she'd decided that was the kind of day it was. The NCIS field office was in a building that looked like an insurance company from the outside. Beige, featureless, the kind of structure that made itself forgettable on purpose. Osei met her in a conference room with two other people Lena hadn't seen before. A man in his 50s with a military bearing and civilian clothes who introduced himself as Agent Harlow, and a woman from the Oregon Department of Justice who gave her name as Deputy AG Simone Fitch, and had the efficient, unhurried presence of someone who had been in rooms like this one many times. On the table, inside a clear evidence sleeve, were photographs. Osei set them in front of Lena one at a time. The first was a handwritten log. Dense entries, dates spanning 14 months. Lena looked at it and understood immediately what she was reading. It was a training record, the kind a handler kept, but the entries weren't about training. They were about correction. Reed had documented what he'd done and when, in the precise, methodical language of a man who thought of himself as following a system. The second photograph was of a drawer's interior. Inside it, an impact tool, the kind used in certain aversion training protocols that had been banned for military working dogs in 2019. The third was a veterinary record, different from the official service records, handwritten, with a date stamp from 8 months ago. A private vet, not Redwood Valley. A clinic in a town 40 miles south. Brief notes. Soft tissue swelling, left hindquarter. Owner reports fall from vehicle. No imaging requested. Lena looked at that one the longest. "He took him to a private clinic," she said. "Yes," Osei said. "One visit. Cash payment. He gave a false last name. And they didn't flag it." The attending vet noted the injury and the explanation and moved on. Osei's voice had no particular judgment in it. "He wasn't looking for what you were looking for." Lena set the photograph down. Her hands were steady. She didn't understand why they were steady, given what was in her chest right now, but they were. "The log," she said. "The handwritten entries. Are they dated?" "Starting approximately 6 weeks after Axel's retirement from service." Harlow spoke for the first time. His voice was clipped, careful. "The entries reference a recalibration program of Reed's own design. He believed Axel had developed," he glanced at his notes, "compliance deficiencies in the final year of service. I was trying to correct them." Lena looked at the photographs. 7 years. Axel had served 7 years, deployed twice, done everything asked of him. And in retirement, the man he'd worked beside for most of his life had decided he needed to be fixed. Had kept a log about it. Had documented it in the same careful handwriting he'd probably used for mission reports. She breathed slowly through her nose. He thought he was training him, she said. He may have told himself that, Fitch said from the end of the table. Was the first thing the deputy AG had said. Her voice was dry and precise. The evidentiary record suggests otherwise. They asked her formal questions for the next 90 minutes. She answered everything. Ose recorded it. Harlow made notes. Fitch occasionally asked follow-up questions that were so specific and well-targeted that Lena revised her estimate of how long this investigation had been building before her report had ever landed. Before she left, Ose walked her to the elevator. The attorney Reed retained, Ose said. He filed an emergency motion this morning to suppress the search results on Fourth Amendment grounds. Will it work? No. Ose said it without hesitation. The warrant was solid, but it will slow things down by a few days. And Reed himself? Ose looked at the elevator doors. He's not in custody. He's been asked not to leave the state. Lena thought about that, about Reed somewhere in Oregon right now, with his flat eyes and his controlled voice and his handwritten log. And she felt a specific clean anger that didn't need to go anywhere but was good to know was there. How is Axel? She asked. Something shifted slightly in Ose's professional surface. The state facility has a staff veterinarian who assessed him on intake. The hip injury is significant. He's going to need surgical intervention. She paused. But he's eating. Lena looked at the elevator doors. That's something, she said. What? She drove back to the clinic through the valley in the early afternoon with the mountains clear on her left and the radio on low, and her mind sorting through what she'd seen on that table. The log. The hidden vet record. The tool in the drawer. Reed had been thorough. That was the part that kept surfacing, not the cruelty itself, which was its own thing, and she'd deal with it later, but the thoroughness. He'd kept records the way he'd been trained to keep records, and somehow it had never occurred to him that those records could become evidence against him, because the framework he operated from didn't include the possibility that what he was doing was wrong. That was the most disturbing part. Not malice exactly. Something closer to a man who had reorganized his definitions until everything fit. She was still thinking about it when she pulled into the clinic lot and saw the car. It was parked directly across from the entrance. Not in a marked space, just pulled to the edge of the lot, engine off. Dark blue. She would have driven past it without a second look, except that as she got out of her own car, the driver's door of the blue car opened. Mason Reed got out. He was alone this time. I was wearing the same tactical jacket from the first visit, and he looked, for the first time since she'd met him, like he hadn't slept. It was a small thing, a slight looseness around the eyes, a flatness to his color. But it was visible, and on a face that usually gave nothing away, it was significant. She stopped. He stopped. The distance between them was about 30 feet of parking lot. I want to talk to you, he said. His voice was the same as always, flat, controlled, but there was something underneath it now, not a tremor, something older than a tremor, something being managed very hard. I don't think that's a good idea, she said. There's an active federal investigation. I know what there is. He took one step closer, not aggressive, almost careful. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm not here about the case. He stopped again, looked at the ground for a moment, then back at her. I want to know if he's okay. She stared at him. Axel, he said. I want to know if he's okay. The parking lot was quiet. A car passed on the road behind her. Somewhere inside the clinic, a dog barked once and then stopped. She looked at Reed's face. She looked at the exhaustion in it, and the control still holding over the exhaustion, and she tried to understand what she was looking at, whether it was remorse or something that only resembled remorse, whether the man standing across from her had any genuine comprehension of what he'd done, or whether he was standing in a parking lot asking about a dog the way you'd ask about a car you'd sold. He's being cared for, she said. Reed nodded. His jaw moved. He looked at the ground again. I never... He stopped. Started again. What I did wasn't... He couldn't finish that either. Captain Reed, she said, I think you should go. He looked at her. His eyes were red around the edges, just slightly, and she didn't know what to do with that, and she didn't think it was her job to figure it out right now. He got back in his car. She stood in the parking lot until he drove away. Then she went inside. Wule was at her station. She looked up when Lena came in, read something in her face, and said, What happened? Reed was in the lot. He wanted to know if Axel was okay. Wool was quiet for a moment. What did you tell him? That he's being cared for. That's more than he deserved to hear. Maybe. Lena set her bag down. I don't know what he deserves right now. I know what Axel deserves. The afternoon moved forward the way afternoons did. Patients, charts, medications. The steady rhythm of a clinic doing its work. Dev brought her coffee at 3 without being asked. Yolanda gave her a small nod every time they passed each other, the kind of nod that was trying to communicate something that didn't have a clean word for it. At 4:30, she received an email from the OSU veterinary program. Wule's colleague, Dr. Abena Mensah, board-certified orthopedic specialist, had reviewed the imaging and filed a formal secondary radiological assessment. The email contained the full report as an attachment and a brief personal note at the bottom. Your read was accurate. These fractures are consistent with repeated blunt force trauma occurring post-service. I've submitted the same report directly to NCIS at Special Agent Osai's request. You should know you were right. Lena read that last sentence twice. Then she forwarded the email to her personal account and the physical copies in her bag and the USB drive, and she let herself sit with it for exactly 1 minute before she closed it and went back to work. The story broke on Thursday morning. She found out the way everyone else did, through a local news alert on her phone at 6:47 a.m., before she'd finished her coffee. The headline was careful. Federal investigation opened into retired Navy SEAL handler following animal welfare complaint at Redwood Valley Clinic. The article was spare on details, credited to unnamed sources close to the investigation, and included a single quoted line from the NCIS Public Affairs Office confirming an active inquiry. Her phone started moving within 20 minutes. Numbers she didn't recognize. She let them all go to voicemail. There were 4 from journalists by 8 a.m. and 1 from a veterans advocacy organization she'd never heard of, and 1 from a woman who identified herself as a former military dog handler in Montana who said she'd seen similar things and wanted to talk. She didn't call any of them back. The clinic was different that morning. She felt it when she walked in, a shift in the atmospheric pressure of the place. Everyone moving through their work with an awareness of the external thing, pressing in at the edges. Yolanda had already fielded 2 media calls by 9. Ferris issued a second clinic-wide communication at 10 asking staff to direct all press inquiries to the administrative line and to have no comment on the record. At 11:15, Osei called. Reed's attorney filed a civil complaint this morning, she said, naming you directly. Lena stopped walking. She was in the hallway between the kennel and the surgical suite. On what grounds? Defamation. Negligent misrepresentation. He's claiming your report caused demonstrable harm to Reed's professional reputation prior to any formal finding of wrongdoing. Osei's voice was steady and informational. I want to be transparent with you. This is a pressure tactic. His attorney knows the civil complaint will not survive given the evidentiary record, but it creates a separate legal process you'll need to respond to. How do I respond to it? You get your own attorney. I can't advise you beyond that, but I'd move quickly. Do you have someone in mind? I'm working on it. She'd spoken to a firm in Eugene on Monday. She hadn't retained anyone yet because the retainer fee was real money and she'd been hoping to avoid it. She stopped hoping that on Thursday at 11:15 and called the firm at noon. The attorney she retained was named Grace Aldine. She was 51, had spent 12 years as a prosecutorial attorney before going into private practice. And she had the energizing effect on Lena of someone who found the complexity of a bad situation interesting rather than overwhelming. The civil complaint is a delay tactic, Aldine said in their first 20-minute call. But it can also be a gift if handled correctly. Discovery works both ways. Anything Reed's attorney wants from you, your discovery process gets to request from Reed. His logs, Lena said immediately. The private vet records. Any other? Already on my list. Aldine's voice was dry and brisk. Don't talk to journalists. Don't post about the case. Don't respond to anything from Reed's legal team directly. Everything through me. After the call, she went back to work. She was doing a recovery check on a cat who'd had a mass removed from her abdomen that morning. Elderly tortoiseshell, seriously annoyed about her cone, but stable, when Yolanda appeared at the door again. Osei is here, she said, and she brought people. Lena looked up. How many people? 4. 2 NCIS, 1 in a JAG uniform, and someone from the DA's office. She set down the chart. The conference room felt smaller with 5 people in it. Osei was at the head of the table. Harlow was beside her. The JAG officer was a woman named Commander Petra Walsh, sharp and contained, with the formal posture of someone who'd spent a long time in rooms where posture mattered. The DA's representative was a youngish man, maybe 32, who introduced himself as ADA Corbin Marsh and had the slightly compressed energy of someone trying to hold a professional demeanor over genuine excitement about what he was about to say. Fitch from the Department of Justice was on a call-in screen at the end of the room. Lena sat down and waited. Osei said, "Earlier today, NCIS obtained the full contents of a secondary data storage device found at Reed's property during the search. It was password protected and flagged for forensic review. Our digital forensics team completed the analysis this morning." She set a folder in front of Lena. Inside the device, we found documentation related to at least 2 other military working dogs Reed had handled during his career. Both were retired before Axel. Both are deceased. She paused for exactly 1 beat. The documentation is consistent in format with the logs found in Axel's case. The room felt even smaller than it had. "Both dogs," Lena said. "Yes." Did anyone? There were no prior complaints. Osei said it without inflection, just fact. Both deaths were attributed to age-related causes. The dogs were 7 and 8 years old, respectively. Lena looked at the folder in front of her. She didn't open it. "Reed's attorney filed the civil complaint this morning," she said. "We're aware," Walsh said. "The timing is notable. He's trying to discredit the original report before the criminal investigation completes." "Yes." Walsh didn't elaborate. Marsh leaned forward. "Ms. Prescott, I want to be direct about where we are. The Oregon DA's office is coordinating with NCIS and the DOJ on potential charges. Animal abuse under Oregon statute is a felony at the level of injury documented here. The federal dimension, because these are military animals, and Reed held federal security clearances through the period in question, expands the scope significantly." He stopped. "We are close to a formal charging decision. We wanted you to know that, and we wanted to inform you in person because the next 24 hours are going to move fast." She looked at him. "How fast?" "Reed's passport was flagged this morning at the request of the U.S. Attorney's Office." He said it calmly, like it was administrative information. "His travel is restricted. His attorney knows this, which means he has no more room to maneuver," she said. "Limited room," Marsh said. "Not none. His attorney is good, but the evidentiary record has become substantial enough that containment is no longer viable." She thought about Reed in the parking lot. "I want to know if he's okay." She thought about the handwritten log, the tool in the drawer, the private vet visit, cash payment, false name, no imaging requested. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Nothing new today," Osei said. "We have what we need. We wanted to give you the context." She looked at Lena directly. "You should prepare yourself for the possibility that this becomes significantly more public in the next 24 to 48 hours. The scale of the documentation, the other dogs, changes the nature of the story." "I understand." She drove home that evening through the valley in the dark. No radio this time. She ate standing over the kitchen counter. She called Aldean and gave her the afternoon's update, and Aldean made notes and said the civil complaint would be answered within the week. She sat on her couch and stared at nothing for a while. Then she called the state facility where Axel was being held. She'd gotten the number from Carver 2 days ago but hadn't used it. It rang 4 times before a man answered, tired-voiced, clearly end of shift. "I'm a vet tech," she said. "I'm the originating complainant in the Axel case. I just wanted to ask, how is he doing? Is he settled?" The man on the other end was quiet for a second. Then, "He's doing better than intake. He's eating consistently now. We've got him in a quieter section of the facility." "Does he?" She stopped. "Is he anxious?" "Less than he was." A pause. "He's a good dog. You can tell. He watches people, but not like he's scared of them anymore. More like he's deciding." She exhaled slowly. "Thank you," she said. She went to bed at 10. She lay in the dark and thought about Axel deciding, watching the people in the facility and assessing whether they were safe, running whatever calculus a 9-year-old dog runs after a lifetime of having the answer to that question be complicated and painful. Learning, maybe. That hands could be still. She was almost asleep when her phone lit up. Text from a number she didn't recognize, different from Voss, different from the anonymous message about the state board filing, different from everyone. She picked it up. "This is Mason Reed. I know you've been told not to communicate with me. I'm not going to contact you again after this. I just need you to know that I'm not going to fight the charges. My attorney doesn't know I'm sending this. I need you to know that what I did to him, what I told myself was training, I know what it was. I'm sorry. Not to you. To him. He can't read a text, so I'm saying it to the person who saw what I didn't let anyone else see. She read it once. She read it twice. She screenshotted it. She forwarded it to Aldean. She forwarded it to Ose's number. She set the phone down on the nightstand screen down and lay on her back in the dark. She stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then, at 1:12 a.m., her phone lit up again. This time, it was Ose. The text said only, "Reed is at the Eugene Field office. He came in voluntarily. He has no attorney present. He's asking to give a full statement." She didn't sleep after Ose's text. She tried. She put the phone back on the nightstand and closed her eyes and lay very still in the dark for about 20 minutes. And then she got up and made tea. She didn't drink and sat at her kitchen table watching the clock move from 1:30 to 2:15, and eventually she stopped pretending she was going to sleep and just sat with it. Reed was in a federal field office at 1 in the morning giving a voluntary statement without an attorney. She ran through what that meant, what it cost a man like that. The controlled surface, the flat management of everything, walking into a federal building in the dark and sitting across from investigators and opening the thing he'd kept sealed. She thought about his text again. He can't read a text, so I'm saying it to the person who saw what I didn't let anyone else see. She thought about what it would take to write those words, and then she put it away because it wasn't her job to process his interior life, and she had enough of her own. What mattered was Axel. What mattered was that somewhere across town, the chain of events she'd set off with a printed report and a phone call was completing itself in a federal conference room, and by morning things would have changed in ways she couldn't entirely predict. She was at her desk by 6. Aldean called at 7:58, before Lena had eaten anything or fully processed being at work. "Reed's statement," she said, without preamble. "How much do you know?" "Only that he went in voluntarily last night. Ose texted me. He gave a full account, 14 months. He confirmed the logs, the tool, the private vet visit. He also disclosed a third incident that wasn't in any of the documentary evidence, a separate injury he attributed to Axel striking a fence during what he called an evasion drill." Aldean's voice was clipped and moving fast. "NCIS is characterizing it as a complete corroborating confession, in writing, recorded, given freely without counsel present. His attorney is furious. He found out at 6 this morning and has been trying to walk it back as coerced, which will go nowhere because Reed drove himself there at 1 a.m. and declined the standard advisement." A pause, brief and pointed. "The civil complaint against you, the defamation claim, is almost certainly being withdrawn today. You can't maintain a defamation action when the subject of the report has just voluntarily confirmed the report's accuracy to federal investigators." Lena sat very still. "And the criminal charges? Oregon DA's office is filing felony animal abuse today. 3 counts, 1 for each documented incident with Axel. The U.S. attorney may add federal charges depending on how the military animal statutes apply. That's still being assessed." Aldean paused again, longer this time. "Lena, the civil complaint being dropped is going to be public. The criminal filing is going to be public. By this afternoon, your name is going to be attached to this story in a very visible way. I need to know how you want to handle it." She looked at her desk, at the stack of charts waiting, at the coffee that was already going cold. "I don't want to make statements," she said. "I'm not interested in being the story. You may not have a choice about being the story. You have a choice about whether you speak." "Then I won't speak." She paused. "Not yet." "Okay." Aldean accepted that without argument. "I'll field the press. Don't pick up unknown numbers." After she hung up, Ferris appeared in her peripheral vision. He was standing in the hallway outside her station with his hands in his coat pockets, and he had the look of a man who had also not slept and was doing a worse job of hiding it. "I heard," he said. "From who?" "Ose's office called the clinic line at 7. Standard notification to parties of interest." He came closer, stopped a few feet away. The civil complaint was formally withdrawn at 7:45. She nodded. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I should have backed you earlier." She looked at him. He was saying it to the space between them rather than directly at her, which was very Ferris, managing even his apologies from a slight remove. "Yes," she said, "you should have." He nodded. He didn't push for forgiveness, which she respected. He went back to his office. The criminal filing hit the local news at 11:47. By noon, it had reached a regional outlet. By 2 in the afternoon, it had been picked up by a National Veterans Affairs publication, which framed it differently than the local coverage. Less about the charges and more about what a military working dog's post-service life was supposed to look like versus what Axel's had been. The clinic's administrative line received 31 calls that afternoon. Yolanda, who was professionally unflappable, handled them with a prepared statement Ferris had drafted with the insurance counsel and delivered so many times by 4 o'clock that she could do it in a single breath. Lena worked through it all. She checked on a recovering diabetic retriever. She assisted Dev with a blood draw on a cat who was having none of it. She ate a granola bar over the sink at 3 because there was no other time. She did not look at her phone except once, when the OSU specialist Mensa sent a brief email. "My formal report has been submitted to the court as requested. I testified to the same findings. Keep going." She kept going. At 4:15, a man she didn't recognize came to the front desk and asked for her by name. Not Press. His ID, when Yolanda asked, was a credential from the Naval Special Warfare Center's Veterinary Liaison Office, a division she hadn't known existed until she looked it up in the 3 minutes Yolanda stalled him. His name was Lieutenant Garrett Nolan. He was in his late 30s, had a quiet, measured quality, and he'd driven up from the Bay Area that morning. "I want to be clear," he said when they were in the conference room with the door closed. "I'm not here on behalf of anyone involved in the investigation. The liaison office operates independently. We deal with the welfare of military working dogs pre- and post-service, and when a case reaches this level of visibility, it's our job to understand what happened." "What does that mean practically?" she asked. "It means I want to hear what you saw, not the filed report. I've read that. Not the statement Ose recorded. What you, a person who works with animals daily, saw when that dog walked into your clinic." She told him. The whole thing, from the first intake to the lobby moment, to the x-rays on the monitor. She told him about the way Axel's eyes moved, about the compliance that had stopped looking like obedience, about the specific quality of the flinch when Ferris had touched his spine. Nolan listened without writing anything down, which was unusual. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The Naval Special Warfare Center has a post-service monitoring program," he said. "It's voluntary for handlers. Reed was enrolled in it for 8 months and then withdrew." He paused. "His withdrawal was accepted without follow-up. That's a gap in our process, and it contributed to this." He looked at her directly. "I can't undo that. What I can do is tell you that the program is being reviewed and that your observations, the behavioral component specifically, are being formally documented as part of that review. So this changes something going forward? We're going to try to make sure it does." He said it without ceremony or inflation, just a plain statement from a man who understood the distance between intention and outcome. "That's not a promise. It's what we're going to try." It was the most honest thing anyone in an official capacity had said to her in 3 weeks, and she appreciated it more than she could cleanly express. After he left, she sat in the empty conference room for a few minutes. The late afternoon light was coming through the window at a low angle, hitting the dust motes in the air and making them briefly visible. She thought about all the processes and reviews and formal documentations, all the machinery that would now turn its attention to the question of what had happened to Axel and how it had been allowed to happen. She hoped the machinery worked. She'd learned, in the past several weeks, not to assume it would. The civil complaint withdrawal was published in the court record at 4:50 p.m. and picked up by the regional legal press within the hour. By evening, 3 separate reporters had published analyses connecting Reed's voluntary confession to the collapse of the defamation claim, and the word corroborated appeared in all 3 pieces adjacent to Lena's original report. Aldian texted, "Don't read the comments. Drink something. Call me tomorrow." She drank water and went to bed at 9 and actually slept, for the first time in a week. The arraignment was set for the following Tuesday. She didn't attend. Aldean had been clear that her presence wasn't necessary and would invite press attention she'd said she didn't want, and that was still true. She found out the details through Aldean afterward. Reed had entered a plea of not guilty as a procedural matter on his attorney's advice, the same attorney who'd been furious about the voluntary statement and was now doing damage control with significantly reduced material to work with. The DA had presented the 3 felony counts. Bail had been set, conditions including surrender of passport and prohibition from owning or residing with animals. That last condition was the one that landed heaviest, though she couldn't entirely explain why. Something about the formality of it, the legal system inscribing into the record that Mason Reed could not be trusted with a living thing. The clinic felt different in the days after the arraignment. She noticed it gradually, the way you noticed a shift in temperature rather than all at once. Dev had started deferring to her observations during rounds in a way he hadn't before. Not dramatically, just a small recalibration, the kind that happened when people updated their assessments and didn't announce it. Yolanda had started routing certain client calls to her, rather than to the associate veterinarians when the questions involved behavioral observations or post-recovery monitoring. Ferris had stopped looking at her like a situation he was managing and started looking at her like a colleague, which was different and took some adjustment. Dr. Wula's colleague Mensa called her on Thursday morning, person to person rather than professionally, and asked if she'd ever considered going back to school. Lena said she'd thought about it. Mensa said there was a post-baccalaureate pathway at OSU for vet tech to veterinary degree transitions, and that the specialty she was clearly drawn to, animal behavior assessment and trauma rehabilitation, was a field with more need than qualified practitioners. She said it the way she said everything else, without sales pitch, just information being offered to someone who might use it. Lena wrote it down. She didn't commit, but she wrote it down. On Friday, Ose called. "I wanted you to hear this from me before it becomes public," the agent said. Reed's attorney has filed a formal challenge to the felony classification. He's arguing that 2 of the 3 counts should be reduced to misdemeanor level based on the nature of the documented incidents and Reed's subsequent cooperation. Lena held the phone. Will it work? The DA's office is opposing it. The judge has 60 days to rule. A pause. The 3rd count is not being challenged. That's the one with the clearest forensic link to the X-ray evidence, which means even in the worst-case scenario, there's a felony that sticks. What does that mean for Reed? Loss of retirement status is possible. The military conducts its own administrative review separately from criminal proceedings. Permanent prohibition from working with animals is already in the bail conditions and will be formalized regardless of how the reduction motion resolves. Ose's voice stayed even. He's not walking away from this. I know. She paused. I just need the 3rd count to hold. It'll hold, Ose said. Not warmly. She wasn't a warm person by nature, but with the particular certainty of someone who had reviewed the evidence enough times to be sure of that one thing. After she hung up, Lena went to the supply room and stood at the shelves for a moment. The same shelves she'd pressed her hands against weeks ago, trying to breathe through the decision to call Animal Services. She touched the metal edge of one shelf. Not for any reason, just to feel that it was still the same room and she was still the same person, and the weight of the past weeks was real and had been worth it. Axel's surgical consultation was scheduled for the Monday of the following week. The state facility had been in contact with Lena through Carver, who'd become something close to a professional acquaintance over the course of the past month. The facility's staff veterinarian, a woman named Dr. Ivy Sato, had been managing Axel's care since intake, and she'd reached out to Lena specifically because of the original imaging work. He's stabilized, Sato said when they spoke by phone. The hip injury is significant but surgically addressable. We're looking at a femoral head ostectomy, removing the femoral head to allow the body to create a false joint. Given his age and the nature of the damage, it's a better option than hip replacement. What's his recovery timeline? 6 to 10 weeks of restricted activity post-surgery, then graduated rehabilitation. Sato paused. His muscle mass on the left side is going to take the longest. The atrophy from months of compensating is significant. He'll need regular structured exercise and probably hydrotherapy. But he'll walk normally? He'll walk. Whether it looks completely normal depends on how the false joint develops. Another pause. He's a resilient animal. I've been watching him for 2 weeks now, and the improvement just from being in a stable environment is visible. Dogs like this, they were trained for high-stress situations. They're cognitively active. They need to feel useful. Once the pain is managed, he'll have drive." She sounded like she meant it. "He's going to be okay." Lena exhaled. It was a slow breath, and it carried more than she meant it to. After the call, she sat down at her desk and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment. Not crying. She was past the point where she cried about things, and before the point where she processed them properly. Just sitting in the weight of "he's going to be okay" and letting it be true. She sent a brief email to Ose, Carver, and Nolan containing the surgical update. She sent a separate email to Aldean flagging it for the legal record. Then she opened the OSU post-baccalaureate program website and read the admissions requirements for 12 minutes before closing it and going back to work. The public hearing on Reed's military administrative review was announced 10 days after the arraignment. She hadn't known such a review would be public. Aldean had explained it as a function of Reed's former rank and the nature of the charges. An officer's administrative separation required a formal board, and when the underlying conduct involved potential federal violations, that board became a matter of record. It was set for a Wednesday, in a conference facility in Portland. She wasn't required to attend. She wasn't named in the board proceedings. She went anyway. She took a personal day. She drove to Portland in the morning through rain that was soft and consistent, the kind of Oregon rain that didn't announce itself, just arrived and stayed. She parked 4 blocks from the facility and walked through the wet air and went inside and found a seat near the back of the public gallery. The room was formal without being ornate, institutional furniture, a panel of 5 board members in uniform across the front, a table on the left for Reed and his attorney, and a different attorney from the one handling the criminal case, a table on the right for the presenting officer from the Judge Advocate General's office. About 30 people in the gallery, press in the designated section. 3 people she didn't know in civilian clothes who had the bearing of veteran community members. Reed was already seated when she arrived. He was in dress uniform, which she hadn't expected, and it did something particular to the visual of him that she needed a moment to process. The uniform was the version of himself he'd built a career inside, and wearing it to a hearing that was designed to assess whether that career had been what he'd said it was. There was something almost unbearable in it. Not sympathetic, just complex, the way things that involved long stretches of time and identity always were. He didn't see her. She was in the back, behind other people, and he was facing forward. The presenting officer laid out the case with surgical efficiency. The animal welfare charges, the voluntary statement, the forensic corroboration, the 2 prior dogs whose records had been recovered from the secondary device, the fact that Reed had been enrolled in the Naval Special Warfare Post-Service Monitoring Program and had withdrawn without follow-up. Each element was presented flat and factual, without drama, which was somehow more devastating than drama would have been. Reed's attorney made a case built on Reed's service record. 12 years. 2 combat deployments, commendations, assessments from commanding officers. He was trying to separate the man's military record from the post-service conduct, and he was doing it competently, but the board was listening to the forensic record with the specific attention of people who already understood that the 2 things were not separate. When the presenting officer was given the opportunity for a closing statement, she said something that Lena would think about for a long time afterward. The panel should understand that military working dogs serve under the same conditions as their human counterparts. They are trained for sacrifice, for endurance, for absolute reliability in situations of extreme stress. In exchange for that service, they are entitled to protection when it is over. The evidence in this record shows that Captain Reed understood those terms well enough to perform them during active service, and chose not to honor them once the terms no longer carried professional consequences for him. She paused. The board should make its determination accordingly. The room was quiet. Reed sat very still through all of it. His attorney leaned over once and said something in his ear. Reed didn't move. The board recessed to deliberate. Lena stood up and went to the hallway. She stood near a window that looked out onto a gray Portland courtyard, a small rectangle of wet pavement, and a single tree still holding its last yellow leaves in the rain, and she stood there for a while. She heard footsteps and turned. Reed was standing 10 feet away. He'd come out a different door and he stopped when he saw her. His attorney was not with him. The hallway was empty except for them. She looked at him. He looked at her. in the dress uniform, with the hearing room behind him, and everything that had been built and was now being formally assessed, he looked like what he was, a man who had done something and was now in the long, grinding process of having it counted. "I didn't know you were here," he said. "I didn't tell anyone I was coming." He nodded. He looked past her at the window, at the courtyard and the tree and the rain. "I keep thinking about when he trusted me," he said. It didn't seem directed at her exactly, more like a sentence he'd been carrying and needed to set down somewhere. "He trusted me for 7 years, and He stopped. "I started believing the trust was mine to use however I needed, that it wasn't—" He stopped again. She waited. "I don't expect anything from you," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything. I just needed to say it out loud, in front of someone who—" He looked at her finally. "You're the only person who understood what he was." She held that for a moment. "He's having surgery next week," she said. "His hip. The prognosis is good." Reed's jaw moved. His eyes went slightly different. "Good," he said. His voice had come undone just slightly at the edges. "That's good." He went back inside. She stood at the window for a while longer. The board returned its determination 65 minutes after recessing. She had gone back to her seat. She watched Reed sit very straight in his chair as the board's presiding officer read the finding. The board had determined that the conduct documented in the evidentiary record was incompatible with the standards expected of an officer of his rank and constituted a serious breach of the duty of care to a military working animal under his guardianship. Accordingly, the board recommended administrative separation, reduction in grade from captain to lieutenant, and forfeiture of retirement benefits pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. The reduction in grade was the thing that visibly landed. She saw it in the set of his shoulders. Not a collapse, just a settling, like something finally bearing its full weight. His attorney made notes. Reed did not move. The press section was already typing. Lena sat in the back of the room and watched the formal conclusion of a military career and thought about a dog in a state facility, eating consistently and watching people with new eyes, and she thought about the x-rays on her monitor and the decision to pick up the phone, and Ferris's face when she told him she understood her position, and Osei's recorder on the exam table, and Wule's colleague saying you were right, and Dev saying I should have said something sooner. She thought about all the small decisions that had looked like risks and had turned out to be the correct path forward, and she thought about the ones that had cost her, the administrative review, the legal threat, the weeks of uncertainty, and she tried to hold both things together without letting one erase the other. It didn't resolve cleanly. That was okay. She drove home through the rain. 2 weeks later, Axel had his surgery. Dr. Sato called her afterward with the update. The procedure had gone well. Recovery was progressing as expected. Axel was awake and comfortable and had eaten a soft meal 3 hours post-anesthesia. He was already trying to shift his weight onto the healing leg, which Sato described as typical of working dogs and mildly exasperating in the best possible way. Carver called the same afternoon with a different kind of update. Reed's attorney formally withdrew the civil complaint this morning, she said. The court record is being updated. The withdrawal cites a change in circumstances, the standard language when a case collapses on its own foundation. And the criminal case? Proceeding. The reduction motion was denied. All 3 counts stand at felony level. The DA's office expects a plea agreement within 30 days, which would avoid trial. A pause. Lena. You should know that the DA's office is going to recommend, as part of any plea, a lifetime prohibition from owning, residing with, or handling animals. That's going to be a formal court order. She was quiet for a moment. Is that standard? For this level of documented abuse, yes. Carver's voice was matter-of-fact. It's not a symbolic gesture. It's enforceable. After the call, she sat at her desk with the afternoon quiet around her, the specific post-shift quiet of a clinic winding down, animals settling into evening, the sounds of a building doing its steady, unheroic work. She pulled up the OSU post-baccalaureate program website again. This time she clicked to the application page. She read through the requirements. She looked at the deadline. She looked at the prerequisite courses she'd need, 2 of which she'd taken at community college 7 years ago and would need to request transcripts for. She pulled up her email and sent a message to the OSU registrar's office requesting information on transcript verification. She didn't send the application, but she started a draft. She was still working on it when her phone lit up with a text from a number that had become familiar over the past weeks. Carver. One more thing. Axel's case file has been officially closed for investigation purposes. He's now being held as available for adoption. The facility will begin the process next week. She read it twice. The adoption priority goes to the originating complainant in abuse cases under Oregon administrative rule. That means you have first right of consideration. She set the phone down on the desk. She looked at the empty exam room across the hall. At the scale by the door, the same scale she'd used for Axel's first visit, the one that had told her the number didn't match the record. At the monitor where she'd looked at the x-rays and sat with them until she was certain. She picked up her phone. She texted Carver back. "When do I need to submit the adoption application?" The reply came in under a minute. "Facility opens at 8. Application window opens same time. First come, first served after the priority period." She looked at the message for a moment. Then she looked at the draft application on her laptop screen, the one for the veterinary program, half finished, requiring transcripts she hadn't requested yet. 2 things that needed doing, both of them hers. She went back to the draft. She typed 3 more sentences. She stopped when she reached the personal statement section, which asked the applicant to describe the experience that had led them to pursue veterinary medicine as a professional path. She stared at the blank field. Then she started typing, and she didn't stop until the section was full. She typed until the personal statement field was full, and then she read it back once and changed 2 sentences and left the rest. It wasn't polished. It started in the middle of a moment rather than at a beginning, because the truth of it didn't have a clean beginning. It had a German shepherd walking through a clinic door with his weight distributed wrong, and a woman noticing something everyone else had already decided not to see. She wrote that. She wrote about what it felt like to look at an x-ray and understand that the evidence on the film meant something that was going to cost her, and choose to submit it anyway. She wrote about the difference between knowing what an animal needs and having the credentials to act on that knowledge, and why she wanted to close that distance. She didn't write about Reed. She didn't name Axel. The statement was about her, and what the past weeks had taught her about the kind of work she wanted to do and the kind of person she already was. She saved the draft at 11:40 p.m. and went to bed and slept without interruption for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember. She was at the state facility at 7:53 in the morning. The building was a low, utilitarian structure on the eastern edge of town, functional rather than welcoming, the kind of facility that existed to do a job rather than to feel good about itself. The parking lot had 4 other cars in it, and the lights inside were already on behind the frosted glass of the entrance. She sat in her car for a few minutes. She thought about what she was about to do, not second-guessing it, just feeling the weight of it. Taking an animal home wasn't a gesture. It wasn't a conclusion. It was the beginning of a different kind of work, slower and quieter than everything that had come before, the kind that happened in ordinary rooms without investigators or board hearings or filed reports. She got out of the car. The intake coordinator, a young man named Felix, who had the energy of someone who took the work seriously without needing the work to be dramatic, confirmed her priority status and walked her through the standard adoption assessment. She answered everything. He noted that she was a licensed veterinary technician with access to professional veterinary support, which simplified several sections of the form. He asked about her living situation, apartment, ground floor, small yard access through a shared space, and whether she had experience with large breed dogs. "Yes," she said. "Not personally owned, but professionally, yes." "Do you understand that he'll need continued rehabilitation support? Regular structured exercise, the hydrotherapy protocol Dr. Sato has outlined, follow-up imaging at 6 weeks and 12 weeks? I've already spoken with Dr. Sato. I know the protocol." Felix nodded, made a note, and went to get her. She waited in the intake room, which smelled like every animal facility she'd ever been in. A particular combination of disinfectant and warm fur and the specific frequency of animals nearby. And she sat very still with her hands in her lap and breathed. The door opened. Axel came in on a loose lead held by a kennel staff member, a woman who was clearly trying to keep her own expression professional and not entirely succeeding. He was thinner than he'd been, and the shaved patch on his left hip where the incision had healed was visible even across the room, a clean pink line against the dark fur. He was moving carefully, deliberately, the false joint doing its new work, and his gait had a slightly different quality than it had before. Not the old compensation, which had been hiding pain, but a newer adjustment, which was learning. He stopped in the middle of the room. He looked at Lena. Not the sweeping surveillance look from the first intake. That was gone. This was something more considered. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the lobby before Reed pulled the leash, but without the leash this time, without anyone else's hand in the equation. Just a dog in a room looking at a person, deciding. She stayed where she was. She kept her hands in her lap. She waited. He walked to her. Not fast. His hip was still finding its range, but without hesitation, a direct and deliberate cross of the room, and when he reached her, he pushed his nose against her hand once, and then stood there with his head close to her knee, and she put her hand on the back of his skull, gently, the same place she'd touched him the first time, and he made that sound again, the locked-up sound, the one from somewhere deep in his chest that had nothing left to hide. She sat with him like that for a while. The kennel staff member was definitely not keeping her expression professional anymore. The plea agreement was announced on a Thursday, 6 weeks after Axel came home. She read about it the same way she'd read most of the case developments, through Aldean's voice on the phone, precise and complete, followed by the public document she'd pull up herself later to read the language directly. 3 felony counts of aggravated animal abuse, Oregon statute. Reed entered a guilty plea to all 3. The DA had pushed for the maximum sentencing range. Reed's cooperation in the voluntary statement had been factored into the agreement, and the resulting sentence was 18 months of supervised probation, mandatory psychological evaluation and treatment, 300 hours of community service, a fine of $40,000, half of which was directed to the State Animal Welfare Fund, and half to the Naval Special Warfare Center's Military Working Dog Rehabilitation Program, and a permanent court-ordered prohibition from owning, residing with, handling, or training any animal for the remainder of his life. Permanent, Lena said. Permanent, Aldean confirmed. Enforceable as a condition of his probation initially, and then as a standalone court order after probation ends. Violation is a criminal offense. And his military status? Administrative separation finalized 2 weeks ago. Reduction in grade stands. Retirement benefits forfeited. His security clearance was revoked as a condition of the federal cooperation agreement. A pause. His attorney released a statement on his behalf, which I'd encourage you not to read. I wasn't going to. Good. Aldean's voice shifted slightly, less attorney, more person. How are you doing? She thought about that. Axel was asleep on the floor behind her, a German shepherd taking up most of the available floor space in her living room, which she'd rearranged twice to accommodate his rehabilitation schedule. He slept heavily now, the way animals sleep when they finally feel safe enough to let their muscles fully release, and the sound of his breathing had become something she tracked peripherally, the way you track weather. I'm okay, she said. I think I'm actually okay. For what it's worth, Aldean said, in 20 years of practice, I've seen a lot of people get here and not be okay. The fact that you are, that's not a small thing. After she hung up, she sat on the floor next to Axel because the couch felt too far away. She put her back against the couch cushions and looked at the afternoon light coming through the window and thought about 18 months of work that had begun with a clipboard she'd forgotten she was holding. Axel shifted in his sleep and put his head on her knee without waking up. She left it there. The letter from the Oregon Veterinary Medical Examining Board arrived in her email at the end of that same week. She almost missed it. She'd been filtering heavily since the story had circulated. Press requests, advocacy organizations, the occasional veteran who wanted to tell her she'd done the right thing, and the occasional different veteran who wanted to tell her something else. She'd answered none of them, but this was from the board directly, flagged as official correspondence, and she opened it. It was a formal commendation, not a document she'd expected to exist. It cited her exercise of reporting authority under Oregon statute, her maintenance of professional standards under institutional pressure, and the accuracy of her clinical observations, as subsequently corroborated by the OSU orthopedic specialist secondary assessment. It noted that her case had prompted the board to issue updated guidance to Oregon veterinary practices on technician reporting authority in animal welfare cases, and that the guidance had been distributed clinic-wide to every licensed facility in the state. At the bottom, a handwritten note from the board's executive director. The regulation always gave you the authority. You're the reason people now know it. She read that twice. She printed it and put it in the folder with everything else: the filed report, Mensa's corroboration email, the plea agreement summary, the board determination from Reed's military hearing. The folder was thick now, and she'd debated what to do with it. She'd decided to keep it, not as a trophy, but as a record, a documentation of what it had taken and what it had cost and what had come of it. Someday, if someone else found themselves standing in a supply room with their hands pressed against metal shelving, trying to breathe through a decision, the folder would be evidence that the decision was survivable. The OSU program sent her acceptance letter 6 weeks after that. She was in the middle of Axel's morning physical therapy when it arrived. A structured walk along the bike path near her apartment, 30 minutes, the pace calibrated to the hip's current capability. He was improving steadily. The false joint had developed better than Sato had projected at the 6-week imaging appointment, and the hydrotherapy had added lean muscle back to the left side in a way that was visible now, the asymmetry slowly evening out. He still watched people. That hadn't stopped. But it had changed quality, less assessment for threat, more general interest in the world. He'd developed opinions about squirrels. He decided the neighbor's tabby cat was worth monitoring from a distance. He'd started sleeping on his back when he felt particularly comfortable, all 4 feet in the air like he'd forgotten he was a war dog, and she'd taken a photograph of it because she needed to have that image somewhere it couldn't be lost. She stopped on the path and read the acceptance email on her phone while Axel investigated a fence post with tremendous focus. She'd been accepted into the post-baccalaureate pathway for the following academic year. She would need to complete 2 prerequisite courses over the winter term. The program director had included a personal note saying that her application's personal statement had been the deciding factor in several committee members' votes, and that they looked forward to having her. She stood on the path with the early morning light coming through the tree cover and the sound of the creek below the trail, and Axel finishing his investigation of the fence post and turning to look at her with the expression he used when she'd stopped moving and he wanted to know why. She put the phone in her pocket. "Okay," she said. "Let's keep going." He fell into step beside her, slightly behind her left leg, the same position he'd probably walked in for 7 years of working life. It wasn't trained behavior she'd asked for. He'd just settled there one day and stayed, and she'd let him, because some things didn't need correcting. The formal recognition ceremony organized by the Naval Special Warfare Center's Veterinary Liaison Office was held in Portland in early March, a small and deliberately low-profile event in a conference room that held maybe 40 people. Lieutenant Nolan had reached out 6 weeks prior to ask if she'd be willing to attend. She'd said yes, and then she'd almost said she'd changed her mind twice and had not said it. She brought Axel. He wore a vest identifying him as a therapy animal in training, which Dr. Sato had helped her arrange because it simplified the logistics, and he walked into the conference room with the particular composure of a dog who had decided that rooms full of people were probably fine. The people in that room were a specific assortment: 3 NCIS agents, including Osei, 2 DOJ representatives, Carver from Oregon Animal Services, Nolan and 2 other liaison officers, ADA Marsh, Dr. Wule, who had come without being specifically invited, and Lena was glad she had, and a group of 8 people from various military working dog advocacy organizations who had been following the case and had reached out to Nolan about attending. There was no stage, no podium, no formal remarks that went on too long. Nolan spoke for about 6 minutes. He covered the case briefly and factually, credited the state and federal cooperation, and then said something that Lena had not expected and didn't entirely know how to hold. "The thing I want this room to understand," he said, "is that what Ms. Prescott did was not extraordinary. It was not beyond the scope of what she was qualified to do. The system gave her the tools and she used them, under conditions that would have caused most people to put the tools down." He paused. "The extraordinary part is that she didn't put them down. And because of that, we are revising our post-service monitoring protocols. We have updated state reporting guidance that has already been distributed to every licensed veterinary facility in Oregon, and one dog, who served this country faithfully for 7 years, is standing in this room instead of somewhere we don't want to think about." Axel, standing beside her, chose that moment to sit down and lean his full weight against her leg, which got a quiet laugh from the room and broke something that had been building in her chest in a way that was better than tears would have been. Osei afterward shook her hand. "You did good work," Osei said. She was someone who didn't hand out language carelessly, and Lena took it accordingly. You did too, Lena said. All of you. We had something to work with because you gave it to us. A pause, and then Ose added, slightly less formally, "He looks good." She looked at Axel, who was currently receiving attention from one of the advocacy group members, a woman who was clearly trying to maintain professional composure and failing happily. "He's getting there," Lena said. Carver found her near the end of the event, when things were beginning to dissolve into smaller conversations and people gathering coats. "I want you to know something," Carver said. She had the same efficient directness she'd had in the clinic conference room all those months ago, except there was something slightly less armored about it now. "I've been doing welfare investigations for 11 years. The number of cases that get to a full criminal resolution with a permanent prohibition—" She stopped, measured her words. "It's rare. The system has gaps, and the gaps usually swallow the cases." She looked at Lena directly. "This one didn't, and I want you to know that what happened here is going to change how we handle military animal cases in this state. The gap that Reed slipped through, the withdrawal from monitoring without follow-up, that's being closed." "I know," Lena said. "Nolan told me." "I wanted you to hear it from the investigation side too." Carver paused. "You're going to be a good veterinarian." It was the first time anyone had called her that. Not a vet tech, not a technician, not an assistant, a veterinarian. Future tense, but stated like a fact. She didn't deflect it. She just said, "Thank you." The spring term at OSU started in late March. She drove to Corvallis 3 days a week for the prerequisite courses, with Axel in the back seat and a schedule that required the clinic to shift her hours, which Ferris had agreed to without negotiating. He'd been different since the hearing, not transformed, not suddenly a different kind of person, but recalibrated in some quiet way that showed up in small things. He'd backed her most recent intake observation on a border collie with a subtle neurological presentation when Dr. Wool's colleague had questioned it. He'd sent her an email the week after the OSU acceptance with one sentence: "Congratulations. We'll work around the schedule. No elaboration, no processing, just accommodation." She'd taken it. The classes were harder than she'd expected and more interesting than she'd feared. The biochemistry was work. The anatomy she already knew better than she'd realized, having absorbed it over years of practical application. And that knowledge came back sharp and specific when the framework was formalized around it. Her professor in the animal behavior course, Dr. Halsey, a deeply tired man who had clearly loved his subject for so long it had become indistinguishable from his personality, stopped her after the third week. "Your responses and discussion," he said, "are coming from somewhere, not just the readings." "I've worked in a clinic for 3 years," she said. "That's not what I mean." He looked at her with the assessing directness of someone who'd been in academia long enough to recognize a particular kind of knowledge when he encountered it. "You're not just observing behavior, you're reading motivation." He paused. "That's harder to teach than anatomy." She thought about a German shepherd looking at a handler instead of the person touching him, about a single step across a lobby floor. "I had a good case study," she said. Axel was doing well enough by April that Sato cleared him for longer walks. She started taking him to the river path on weekend mornings when the weather was right. Long, slow walks, an hour or sometimes more, following the water through stands of Douglas fir and cedar that were still wet from the night. He'd learned to navigate uneven terrain without favoring the hip the way he used to. The false joint working in coordination with the rebuilt muscle. The movement increasingly natural. He still watched people on the path. Runners, cyclists, the occasional dog pulling its human in a direction it hadn't negotiated. He watched them all with that considered, unhurried attention, assessing, categorizing, updating his understanding of what the world was currently doing. But he didn't monitor her anymore. That distinction, which was invisible to anyone who hadn't known what it looked like before, was everything. He walked beside her and looked at the world around him and occasionally glanced up to check her position, not out of vigilance but out of preference, the way any social animal checks on the person it's chosen. She'd started talking to him on the walks. Not command language. She didn't phrase things as commands. Just talking, narrating whatever she was thinking, the biochemistry she was processing, the case notes from the clinic, the specific problem she was trying to solve in her personal statement for the full veterinary school application she was building toward. He didn't respond in any language she could parse, but he listened in the particular way dogs listened, fully, without reservation, without the exhaustion people sometimes brought to other people's words. One Saturday in April, they were nearly to the far bend in the river path when she stopped. She stopped because she wanted to, not because anything was wrong or urgent or unresolved, just because the light was hitting the water in the specific way it did at that hour in that season, and Axel had sat down beside her without being asked, and the morning was quiet in the way that the world is sometimes quiet when enough hard things have settled. She thought about the night she'd sat at her kitchen table filing that first report. The specific quality of alone that came with doing the right thing when nobody was backing you yet. The way the cursor had blinked in the submission field before she'd pressed the button, and the way she'd pressed it anyway. She thought about everything the past months had cost, and everything they'd built, and she tried, standing on a river path in Oregon in early spring, to hold those two things together honestly. Not to flatten the cost into something clean, not to inflate the outcome into something easier than it had been. It had been hard, and it had been slow, and at several points it had seemed genuinely possible that the system would just stop, would file the thing and close it, would let the gap swallow the case the way gaps swallowed cases. It hadn't. Not because the system was good exactly, but because enough people inside it had done the right thing when the right thing had been handed to them. Carver, who had moved fast. Osei, who had pushed. Wule, who had looked up the regulation on a Sunday. Mensa, who had read the images and filed her assessment and written you were right at the bottom of an email, like it was the simplest thing. And all of them had been handed something to work with because she had not put the tools down. She'd thought about that a lot, about what it meant practically for the next time someone stood in a supply room trying to breathe. It wasn't that the outcome was guaranteed. It wasn't that doing the right thing was safe. It was something more uncomfortable than that the work of being the person who doesn't look away was worth doing even before you knew whether it was going to land, because the alternative was being someone who looked away. And she had tried that briefly at the beginning of the Axel case when Ferris had told her to let it go, and it had lasted approximately 3 days before her body rejected it entirely. Some people were built to look away and live fine. She wasn't one of them. She'd stopped treating that like a problem. Axel stood up. He looked at her, then at the path ahead, then at her again. "Okay," she said. "I know." They walked. Mason Reed completed his first 90 days of probation in April without incident. His attorney had released no further statements. He had, as best anyone could determine, withdrawn entirely from the public-facing veteran community organizations he'd once been visible in, which was not a condition of his probation, but was perhaps its own kind of reckoning. The slow realization that the identity he'd worn as armor was no longer available to him in the same form, if it ever had been. She didn't follow his movements and she didn't look for updates. He was not her concern anymore. She had chosen, deliberately, not to carry him. The permanent prohibition was the last thing she'd needed to see finalized, and it was in the court record and enforced, and the enforcement had teeth. That was enough. In May, the Naval Special Warfare Center published an updated post-service monitoring policy for military working dogs, with a mandatory follow-up protocol for handlers who withdrew from the voluntary program. Lieutenant Nolan sent her the document when it was released. The cover memo cited the Axel case by file number, not by name, but anyone who knew the case would know, and noted that the policy update had been driven by a gap identified during the investigation. She read the 12-page document in an evening, sitting on her floor with Axel stretched out beside her, and she made 2 margin notes on procedural points that she thought could be strengthened, and then she filed it in the folder with everything else and closed the folder. Done. Set. Her 12-week imaging appointment for Axel was a Friday morning in May, conducted by Sato at the state facility's outpatient veterinary suite. Axel bore the process with the resigned tolerance of an animal who had decided that being handled was fine as long as the handling was respectful, which it was. Sato looked at the images for a long time. Then she looked up with an expression that she was clearly trying to keep professional. "The false joint is fully established," she said. "Muscle development on the left side is within the normal range now, not quite symmetrical with the right, but within normal." She pointed to one image. "He's going to have a slight irregularity in gait for life. But there's no indication of chronic pain. His quality of movement assessments are all trending positive." Lena looked at the images. She knew how to read them now, or she was learning how. Not the full reading, not yet, but the beginning of it. The shapes and densities that meant things. "He's okay," she said. He's better than okay. Sato set the image down. He's a very healthy 9-year-old dog with a well-healed hip and someone who's been doing the right things. She looked at Lena. You've been doing the right things. Axel, sitting on the exam floor between them, looked from Sato to Lena and back again with the expression he used when he understood a conversation was about him and was waiting for the conclusion. You're fine, Lena told him. He seemed to take that as sufficient. She submitted the full veterinary school application in June. She drove to the mailbox in the late evening so she could do it while it was quiet, which was irrational, given that it was an online application, so she submitted it from her kitchen table at 11 p.m., with Axel asleep on the floor and the window open to the early summer night. She pressed submit and then sat with her hands in her lap and thought about the blank personal statement field 9 months ago and the words she'd put in it, and the folder on her shelf with everything documented and in order, and the dog on her floor with his feet in the air. There were no guarantees from here. The program was competitive. The prerequisites had gone well, but the full degree was a different scale of commitment, and she'd be doing it while working, and it would be hard in the specific sustained way that hard things were hard. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just demanding and daily, and requiring her to keep going even when the forward motion was invisible. She knew how to do that. She'd learned it in a clinic hallway with a letter of administrative review in her hands, and a report already filed and no one yet backing her, holding her ground because putting the tools down had never been a real option. She turned off the kitchen light. She sat on the floor next to Axel instead of the couch, her back against the cushions, the summer night coming through the window. And she put her hand on the back of his head in the place she always touched, and he shifted without waking and settled heavier against her. Outside, the valley was dark. The mountains she couldn't see from here were still there. She knew their shape now, had driven toward them enough times to understand their position relative to wherever she stood. In the morning, she would drive to campus for a review session. She would come home and take Axel on the river path. She would go to the clinic and do the work she knew how to do. And she would build toward the work she was learning how to do. And the distance between where she was and where she was going would close the way distances did, slowly, then undeniably. There was something she'd understood, somewhere in the long middle of all of this, that she hadn't been able to articulate until now. The world didn't change because someone was finally right. It changed because someone who was right didn't stop, didn't wait for permission, didn't look at the room and decide the room was too full of the wrong people and turn around. She had not been loud about it. She had not been fearless. There had been nights she'd eaten things she didn't taste and stared at ceilings and calculated how wrong this could go, and the answer had sometimes been, very wrong actually, in ways I can't fully predict. She'd gone to work in the morning anyway. That was the whole thing, really. Not the commendation letter or the court order or the program acceptance or even Axel's imaging results. Clean and improving and no longer hiding anything. Those were outcomes. What she'd actually done was simpler and less impressive and more repeatable. She had looked at something true and not looked away from it, and she had kept not looking away when it would have been much easier to. You could do that without being extraordinary. You just had to be willing to be inconvenienced by what you knew. Axel's breathing deepened. He was completely asleep, all the way down, the kind of sleep that had nothing left to guard against. She stayed with him in the dark for a while. Then she got up and turned off the light and went to bed, and the morning was coming, and there was work to do.